Secretary of State and Chief Election Nerd Phil McGrane joined me on Wednesday to talk about the lead up to Tuesday's primary election. Thanks so much for joining us this morning. This is your first legislative primary as Secretary of State, though of course you aren't any stranger to elections. How is prep going?
The election's going really well. This is certainly the biggest election we've had since being in the office, and it really is different sitting in this role compared to when I was at the county. At the county, it's boots on the ground, getting everything ready, all the materials sent out to the polling places, getting poll workers trained, and here we're fielding lots of questions, a huge increase in campaign finance questions that we're having to navigate. Yesterday afternoon, we did a Zoom call across the state with all the county clerks and election staff just to check in, see where people are, answer some of those last minute questions. I think the election is going well, getting ready for it, but it is different sitting there trying to respond to 44 locations rather than just, handling my own shop. But I love elections. This is our season.
We've talked a lot about voter confidence with you over the last 2 years since you were candidate, McGrane. Since taking office, what have you done to shore up the process or reassure voters that this is a secure elections process?
Yeah, I think we've made a number of upgrades. I mean, part of it is just making elections accessible. As we like to say in the office, making elections fun again. So one of the big changes we've done is the new Vote Idaho website. That's really trying to bring all of the election information to one page, make it easy to register, request an absentee ballot, find election results. That'll be one of the things that we're working on for this particular election is a new results page. So there's a lot of really good things there, and just really bringing all that information in one spot. I know you're someone who's navigated all these websites over the years, so hopefully you've seen the benefits of that, or some of the data that we share that's just really interesting insight in terms of voters moving to Idaho and what's happening in the state. And then you add to that through the legislative process some of the changes that we've made statutorily. So we passed legislation this year saying that none of the tabulation equipment will be connected to the internet. In addition to doing that, we also updated that language because it was all written for punch card machines, and some of our laws are just overdue for an overhaul. And so we were able to upgrade to modern technology in that front. Similarly, we reformed the identification requirements for registration. There were very different requirements to register to vote for the ID you showed versus voting. And so trying to bring that together makes it easier for poll workers, and really it's actually proven out to be really successful in terms of identifying and make it smooth for people who need to be able to register to vote, and in some cases stopping people who probably shouldn't have been able to register to vote in the past.
You say making elections fun again. Elections have always been fun.
Especially for people like us.
Right, exactly. Yes. It's so funny to hear you say we're upgrading the technology for the voting machines, and at the same time you're removing it from the internet to kind of create that barrier against those cyber attacks that we've heard so much about. What are you hearing from other secretaries of state across the nation about different threats that they're receiving to their systems, and how does that shape what you're doing here?
Yeah, it's actually really interesting. That's been one of the neat things stepping into this role, is working with the other secretaries around the country. So I actually sit as the Republican secretary on the EII-SAC. It's the election information, basically cyber information sharing exchange between the 50 states. So Secretary Bellows from Maine and I are the two secretaries that sit on this to really try to get more resources for cybersecurity. I mentioned no connectivity to the internet. That's because really that's the simplest and easiest, most cost-effective solution. But there still are other systems, our voter registration system, the computers that all of the counties use to administer the election. So we're being very vigilant. And a state like Idaho, it's really important to be a player in this space because we have the Ada counties of the world, so often referred to as the great state of Ada because of the resources here. But we have two counties, Clark and Camas, that have less than 350 registered voters. They have the same cybersecurity challenges and the same administration challenges that Ada County does, but nowhere near the resources. So we're trying to tap into what resources we can to make them more resilient, because nowadays we're all interconnected. And that's important. That's what helps prevent voter fraud. That's what keeps our voter rolls clean. And so part of our office's role is to really support and facilitate these things for the counties so that we can all have confidence when we go. The results are what we expect. Everyone's vote counts. It only counts once. I think we've got a really good system in place, and we really, over the last 4 years, starting with Secretary Denny, but now into what we're doing, have been able to bolster that.
You mentioned some of the data that your site has put out, and one of the things that caught my eye and so many other people's eye was the where new voters are coming from. Coming from out of state, a lot of them are registering or affiliating as Republicans. We have, as you know, so many new voters in this state because of that population growth over the last few years. How does that change voter outreach efforts?
It's been interesting since we shared that data, how much attention that's gotten, not just here in Idaho, but nationally. The Washington Post has written about it, the Seattle Times, just because it's fascinating to see between states where people are shifting. And you're right, we've had tremendous growth. I think one of the really big things we've done this election is we have an effort to raise awareness for the primary election. So we've got TV ads, we've got radio ads, newspaper. We're trying to hit every possible medium in terms of connecting with voters. And that's because, as you know, the primary election is so significant. And we never see anywhere near the turnout for the primary that we will in November for the general. And while we all know there's a presidential election coming up and there will be a lot of attention in November, for us, and you're seeing it right now through our campaign finance data, like this is the Super Bowl for Idaho. Whether it's District 19, which is the most solidly Democratic district, that will be determined here in May. Similarly, in District 14, one of its neighbors, that will be determined here in May. And so trying to just raise awareness that May is a time that we vote. Hopefully we'll see increased turnout. I think some of the activity we're seeing in the election will increase turnout as well. These precinct committee races that have normally gone unnoticed are bringing more attention to the election in an interesting way. And so hopefully we're connecting with people. I think the biggest change is just getting information out to voters. That's where the Vote Idaho website, that's where my efforts on the voter guide is trying to say, like, we have people who just moved here in the last year. They don't know who these people are. They don't know who the candidates they're choosing from. Can we get more information out to voters?
And you touched on so many things that I want to ask you about, particularly spending. It is bonkers expensive, along with, we have more people and we have more money going into these races. From your perspective, is it just bigger numbers in a spreadsheet, or does that change your approach to how you work with campaign finance reporting?
It's tough to really emphasize just how much more money we're seeing this cycle than before. I know the Idaho Capital Sun did a story recently just looking at April's numbers and showed that there was a threefold increase in the amount of spending from 2 years ago to this cycle for legislative races. I noted just before I came over here, in the last 48 hours, there's been almost $750,000 spent on independent expenditures alone, most of that coming from out of state. Coming from these Washington, D.C. groups, we're seeing way more money coming in. I saw a photo that someone shared where a voter had received 12 different mailings, all different attacks. There were, I think, 4 were in support. The remaining 8 were opposed. 4 of those mailings were all from the same group. They were different mailers from the same organization. We're going to see record numbers in terms of the spending for this election, and it's worth noting, there are no statewide races. The governor's not on the ballot. So the things that normally draw big dollars aren't even on the ballot this year. It's really these legislative races that we're just seeing. It's really a game changer. I think that ties to our growth as a state and just the vitriol in politics these days. National level, local level, it's all the same.
And for people who aren't familiar, who aren't the election nerds, what is an independent expenditure and how is it different than what a candidate reports?
Yeah, that's a great question. So a lot of time when you see a yard sign on the side of the road, a candidate put it up, it was paid for by the candidate, they raise money. Candidates have limits. So for legislative races, they can only collect up to $1,000, doesn't matter who it's from.
Per donor.
Per donor, good question. Yep. The independent expenditures are, the United States Supreme Court has held organizations, other people can spend unlimited, and so they just can't connect and coordinate with the candidates themselves. And so the candidates, when you see a candidate's name or something, whether it's for or against, no one's talking to them. No one's asking for their permission before it comes out. Instead, these attacks,
or they're not supposed to.
They're not supposed to.
Right.
We do regulate that. We're very active in investigations right now on a number of different issues. But one of it is there's no limit. So we anticipate we'll see a couple organizations easily spend $500,000. And in Idaho politics, that's huge amounts of money. A typical legislative candidate may raise $20,000 to $30,000. A really, really active candidate will raise $100,000. And so to see $500,000 in some of these races is wild.
These outside groups, and you mentioned a lot of it is coming from Washington, D.C., Are there any specific races that they are targeting? I can think of a couple off the top of my head, but what are you seeing?
No, it actually looks like it's a pretty broad swath, and you're even seeing some like interesting exchanges between what I'll call the caucuses in the groups. There's the Freedom Caucus, the Main Street Caucus, and others. But it's interesting because I don't think DC is necessarily coordinating at all with people locally, because you're seeing frustration in both directions. I think the two that get the most attention are the Pro Tem and the Speaker of the House. I think these DC groups, if they're able to knock off either of those individuals, that's a huge feather in their cap going back to their donors. And I think that's fearful because it's people who aren't connected necessarily to people here in Idaho. And that just feels, I think we want Idaho elections to be determined by Idahoans. And hopefully that information gets out there. But from where we sit, it's wild to see all the activity that's going on.
Will that spending then inform maybe potential changes to campaign finance law or proposals to change campaign finance law in the future?
I'm hopeful that we have the opportunity in the next legislative session to really revisit campaign finance. Now, I've always had thoughts about it, but now that I'm sitting in the role and we're spending the majority of our time on enforcement, whether that's being the tattletale department because people are like, please tell them to stop picking on me, or because we're having like actual issues that we are having to work with the AG's office on enforcement with, there really is a need for reform. Our laws were written in the 70s. It was a citizens initiative. It shows up that way in a number of ways. And I think candidates, it's been interesting because more legislators are pinging us than I think historically have, because everyone's frustrated. Especially, our laws really weren't written with this outside money in mind. It was all local when it happened before. And so we really do need to revisit how we do this. Things like independent expenditures, not so that we're not going to see it stop. That's one of the things. Free speech is an important thing that we need to protect. And political speech is the #1 form of free speech. But at the same time, disclosure as to who is it that's influencing things, where's this money coming from, we could do a lot better in terms of getting that out to the public.
We're also seeing a lot more spending on precinct committee races than I know I was expecting. I knew that they would be competitive. I did not expect this. First of all, for those who aren't familiar, what is a precinct?
Precinct committeemen, they are officers for the political parties, so both the Republican Party and the Democratic Party have them on the ballot. Typically, you only see one candidate file for many of these seats. They're the people who go to the monthly meetings and are the ones helping get out the vote for their political party or support their candidates. It's become way more contentious. That's exactly what we're seeing. There's way more competitive races than ever before in this cycle, and money, like real money being put into precinct committee races. Those races aren't regulated by our sunshine laws. So we don't post, we don't share. They don't have to disclose who the donors are. And there are no limits, and we're kind of seeing that. I saw a precinct committeeman billboard on my way into work this morning. That seems wild in terms of all of this. I will note, because as we try to promote this election, trivia has been our theme. One of the most interesting things is the precinct committeeman position is the only position in Idaho that has a minimum number of votes required. And that's 5 votes. You cannot, even if you're unopposed, you must get 5 votes to be elected as a precinct committeeman. Even the governor doesn't require 5 votes, which is just an odd tweak in our laws.
For those 350 or so voters in Clark County, that might actually be problematic.
I have seen candidates not get the necessary 5 votes in the past. So this just shows my nerdiness when it comes to the elections, but there's a lot to watch with the primary coming up.
So you mentioned that precinct committee races, they're not beholden to the same campaign finance reporting.
That's right. There realistically is no regulation in terms of the precinct committee position. We advise people to put the paid for by, but even if they do, there's no linking it back to what that source really is.
And I imagine those laws were written back when parties had to beg people to run for these positions. That's not the case anymore. Do the laws need to change?
It's an interesting thing. The precinct committee positions, they really are party offices. They're not public offices like we think of as a legislature or a state office. And so there's this weird interplay where here we are as the state helping select members of a private organization, the political parties. And I think there's differing opinions on how much state involvement should there really be. Are these really elected positions? Some people think yes, they are. Others think no, they're not. We could probably revisit that as a state. To your point, we've never seen this in the past. This is all bigger in terms of the money, the interest, and even the fighting. I think there's a presumption that within the political parties, everyone's getting along and they're trying to stop the other side. Well, we're certainly seeing in both political parties, but especially here in Idaho in the Republican Party, a lot more contention in the ranks.
You don't say. Secretary of State Phil McGrane, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.